This is very significant news. We have obtained the opening statement that Gordon Sondland is delivering to this committee, and it is quite revealing. In this statement, what he is testifying before these committees determining whether to impeach the President of the United States is that the President of the United States put on hold an effort to strengthen relations with the Ukrainian government until they were in contact. These U.S. officials were in contact with Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal attorney, who at the time was pursuing investigations into the Bidens and the 2016 campaign. Now, let's get into some of the particulars of this rather detailed opening statement. He said that in May 2019, after President Zelensky of Ukraine had been inaugurated and they went to his inauguration, Sondland and other U.S. officials went to brief President Trump about exactly how to strengthen relations with the country. Now, he said that the president essentially said, talk to Rudy Giuliani. According to his testimony, he says President Trump was skeptical that Ukraine was serious about reforms and anti-corruption, and he directed those of us present at the meeting to talk to Rudy Giuliani about his concerns. He says it was apparent to all of us that the key to changing the president's mind was Mr. Giuliani. Then he said after that, Rick Perry, the energy secretary, and then the special envoy to Ukraine, Kurt Volker, were in contact, were reaching out to Rudy Giuliani. He said that they were disappointed, Volker and him, that the president said that. And he said that there should be, quote, no preconditions for having such a meeting between the president of the United States and the president of Ukraine. And then he said this. He said, based on the president's direction, we were faced with a choice. We could abandon the goal of a White House meeting for President Zelensky, which we all believe was crucial to strengthening U.S.-Ukrainian ties and furthering long-held U.S. foreign policy goals in the region, or we could do as President Trump directed and talk to Mr. Giuliani to address the president's concerns. He said they were left with a choice, and they ultimately choose to listen to the president and reach out to Rudy Giuliani. Now, he said that he wasn't aware until, quote, much later that Rudy Giuliani's agenda might include an effort to, quote, prompt the Ukrainians to investigate Biden and his son or to involve Ukrainians directly or indirectly in the president's 2020 election campaign. This is according to Gordon Sondland's opening statement, a Trump appointee. Now, he said that he spoke to Rudy Giuliani afterwards in August, only a handful of times. He said that when he spoke to Rudy Giuliani about the public meeting, Rudy Giuliani asked for a public statement from Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, committing that Ukraine would look into corruption issues. And according to Gordon Sondland, Mr. Giuliani specifically mentioned the 2016 elections, including the DNC server and Burisma, as two anti-corruption investigatory topics of importance to the president. Now, according to Sondland, Giuliani did not explicitly say the Bidens, but he came to learn later that Hunter Biden was on the board of this company, and that's what apparently that Rudy Giuliani was talking about. And there were also these questions about quid pro quo and those texts that have emerged from the top diplomat from currently in Ukraine, Bill Taylor, who raised concerns about a potential quid pro quo. They had exchanged texts with Gordon Sondland. Sondland went to President Trump and talked to him about this, and he said that he had a brief phone call with the President Trump. The president, according to Sondland, was in a, quote, bad mood. And when he called the president in September to ask him, what do you want from Ukraine? The president said nothing. He repeated multiple times, no quid pro quo, no quid pro quo, no quid pro quo. But significant here, the president's top ambassador to the European Union is testifying that the president directed him to deal with his personal attorney in order to further the personal attorney's agenda, Rudy Giuliani, which was to investigate the Bidens and the 2016 elections.
So help us out here, Monica, because it's a lot, I think, for people at home to digest. So he says he went to the president, and the president told him there was no quid pro quo. But you're saying he's also testifying here that he realized that this relationship with Ukraine was being put on hold by the president until they routed things through his personal lawyer. And then he later found out that involved in that was investigating Joe Biden. Is that a correct reading there?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right, because what Sondland testifies to is that it was very important for the Ukrainian government to have a meeting with the president to talk about how they can bolster this key strategic alliance. But the president was just not interested in that because he had directed the U.S. officials, government officials, to talk to his personal attorney first, deal with Rudy Giuliani first. And that's a significant statement here. I mean, it's saying that Rudy Giuliani was interested in potentially helping the president's 2020 election. That's what he learned. Gordon Sondland learned later that could be what Rudy Giuliani's agenda was about. Stunning here, because what Sondland is essentially saying here, this was the president's directing him to do something, and Giuliani was up to something else, completely separate from U.S. official policy that was being carried out by the State Department.
That is remarkable testimony.
It is. Manu, stay there. We're going to bring in Josh Dawsey as well, White House reporter for the Washington Post, who's done extensive reporting, especially this week, on Sondland, as we get some more information on what just crossed, which is a letter from Sondland's lawyers explaining why he is not turning over some of those key documents. So we'll get to Manu on that in a moment. But, Josh, I mean, your in-depth reporting this week paints the picture of Sondland, a true Trump ally, someone who was a, as you put it, collector of relationships, who wanted the power associated with an ambassadorship and would do a lot to get that power from President Trump.
Right. Sondland was a big RNC donor and a Jeb Bush donor, and once the president came into office, he had to work to show that he was loyal to the president. He worked Steve Mnuchin, Jared Kushner, Reince Priebus, others to eventually get an ambassadorship. And once he received an ambassadorship, Sondland was willing to be very loyal to the president. He somehow managed to take over the Ukraine portfolio. He was working outside the National Security Council. He was going straight through Mick Mulvaney and the president repeatedly to handle Ukrainian issues. And Gordon Sondland became a key player in this role through initially giving lots of money to the Republican Party. Then after he made some anti-Trump comments during the campaign, repeatedly ingratiating himself with top advisors to convince them to give him a post in the administration, and now playing a key role in all of this.
Yeah. Listen, we are, and folks at home, we just have a copy now of his testimony that Mana was referencing here. And I do want to read a section again here because this is a remarkable break between the EU ambassador Sondland, a Trump appointee and a Trump loyalist since he joined the government, although, as Josh Dawsey notes in his column, during the election he did not support President Trump, but did. Listen to this quote. "It was apparent to all of us that the key to changing the president's mind on Ukraine was Mr. Giuliani." Before that, he said, "Trump was skeptical that Ukraine is serious about reforms and anti-corruption and directed those of us present at the meeting to talk to Mr. Giuliani, his personal attorney, about his concerns." Mono, I mean, you got to some of this before. I think it just bears repeating for folks at home because, again, it's hard to digest all this. But where he is differing with the president here, or what is at least corroborating here, is what was an essential thrust of the whistleblower's complaint, right, was that Ukraine policy, a key strategic partnership, was being hijacked by the president's personal political interest there, as led by his lawyer.
And predicated on investigations, right? That's what he seems to be saying here.
Oh, we
can't hear him.
There he is. Mike's back up.
Energy company.
Start from the top, just because we lost your mic at the beginning, Manu.
Oh, sure. Yeah, just two key aspects of the investigation that Giuliani was pursuing, both Burisma, this energy company, which Hunter Biden was on the board of, and also what was happening in the 2016 elections. There's been an effort by Giuliani and others to undercut the U.S. Intelligence Committee's findings that Russia was interfered in the U.S. elections in an attempt to help President Trump. Those were the two key things that he was trying to do, that Giuliani was trying to pursue. And Sondland makes very clear in this testimony that he is, quote, disappointed by the president's direction for him to talk to Rudy Giuliani because of that, because they believe they can help with this key alliance, this key deterrent to Russia, Ukraine, and they could work with President Zelensky. But the president of the United States just was not interested in that until Rudy Giuliani was talked to. And yes, you mentioned it. This is what the whistleblower complaint, the thrust of the whistleblower complaint. Here's the president's top appointee essentially confirming key elements of that.
Yeah. Here's another part that strikes us on page 8 of what he'll say in his opening remarks today. Quote, "We were also disappointed by the president's direction that we involve Mr. Giuliani. Our view was that the men and women of the State Department, not the president's personal lawyer, should take responsibility for all aspects of U.S. foreign policy toward Ukraine." Okay, Josh, he's going to say that, or maybe saying that right now behind closed doors, but the way he acted was to still call the president in that 5-hour break to figure out how the president wanted him to answer diplomat Bill Taylor's key question of, Are we holding up aid because you want this, political agenda carried out? He may say he believed this, but critical is how he acted as well.
Right, but you saw last night when Rick Perry did this remarkable interview with the Journal where he said also, we were told to route everything through Rudy Giuliani. What was happening here from a macro sense is that different people in the administration who were in charge of his policy were continuing to be told they had to deal with Rudy Giuliani. John Bolton, Fiona Hill, John Bolton, Gordon Sondland, Kurt Volker, a number of folks in the administration. Everything was going through Rudy Giuliani to some degree. And what folks were trying to figure out is what conversations was the president separately having with Rudy Giuliani? What was happening with the military aid behind the scenes? What were parts of the channels that they could not see? Because there was one official foreign policy being run here, according to testimony and our reporting, and then there was a shadow policy also being run, and different people inside the government were told, you have to go through Giuliani.
Yeah, and it continues down here, something you referenced, Josh, that he says, I did not understand until much later that Mr. Giuliani's agenda might have also included an effort to prompt the Ukrainians to investigate Vice President Biden or his son, or to involve Ukrainians directly or indirectly in the president's 2020 re-election campaign. Again, that's a Trump appointee in his testimony. I'm not saying these lines could nearly be lifted from the whistleblower's complaint, but substantively, they capture what was the thrust of that complaint. It's remarkable testimony.
Yeah, that's true.
Mano, I know you're going to be watching this closely on the Hill. Josh Dawsey, you've been covering the story from the beginning. Great to have you on. For all of you at home and our international viewers as well, we're going to stay with the breaking news and be right back. The breaking news, Gordon Sondland, the president's EU ambassador, a Trump appointee. We now have his testimony, the opening statement to what will be sworn testimony before 3 committees today. Joining us now to discuss is Michael Gerhardt, a CNN legal analyst, law professor at the University of North Carolina. He also testified during the impeachment of President Clinton. Good morning, Michael. You know a thing or two about this. Tell us the significance, because just before the break, we were looking at some key points to his opening statement and really the language here, where he establishes that, in fact, it was clear to him and to everyone else working on Ukraine policy that they had to sort of sidetrack themselves and run business via Rudy Giuliani at the president's direction. How significant is it to hear that as part of the impeachment inquiry, but particularly from someone who ostensibly is a Trump loyalist?
I think it's very significant. He's not the first person who's worked under this president who now is saying some things that are inconsistent with what the president has said. More importantly, what he said, as you've already pointed out, is quite consistent with what the whistleblower said. That's the first important reason why this counts a lot. The second reason is one of the critical things to think about in impeachment is what the late Howard Baker said during the Watergate hearings. What did the president know, and when did he know it? It appears that the president was involved with this pretty much from the beginning and used an irregular process to try and get Ukraine to do work that would help his reelection.
What's also interesting in these prepared remarks, Michael, and you just wrote an interesting op-ed about the president and these impeachment proceedings, and you say the president's sort of MO here is treat me like a king. And you see some of that play out here, right, by this argument by Sondland that the president directed everything to go through Giuliani, not the career officials at the State Department. But Sondland also is going to testify that, quote, inviting a foreign government to undertake investigations for the purpose of influencing an upcoming U.S. election would be wrong. Now, his defense here is he didn't know the politics of it. He didn't know that this was about going after Joe Biden for a while until much later. But that's significant for him to say that would be wrong, right?
That's correct. It's also significant that from the very beginning, even according to Ambassador Sondland, the president directed people to go outside the usual process. That we might think of that as something raising a suspicion. And at the same time, I think what we're finding is that Sondland was not the only one dealing with Mr. Giuliani. Think about it this way. What is Rudy Giuliani there for? He's there to get dirt on Joe Biden and his son. And that is a very important a fact to kind of keep a focus on, because it could suggest that the president really did cross a line here, which is clearly a basis for impeachment.
Okay, Michael Gerhardt, thank you very much for rolling with it on the breaking news. We have to get a quick break in, and we'll be back on the other side.
Another story we're following this morning, the British Prime Minister and the EU say they have reached a new preliminary Brexit agreement. Should be clear, though, the UK Parliament still has to approve it. Not clear that they have the votes to do so. Boris Johnson saying, however, he's confident the government will get the votes to ratify.
But Parliament rejected several of former Prime Minister Theresa May's Brexit plans. Johnson is getting pushback already from other parties on this new deal, so it is anything but a sure bet. We will stay on it, though. Also, the busy Thursday morning, we do begin with breaking news. A key player in the impeachment inquiry, U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland, right now on Capitol Hill behind closed doors, answering questions from lawmakers who want to know about his role in President Trump's pressure campaign on Ukraine to find dirt on political rivals like Joe Biden and his son Hunter. At the center of it, September text exchanges Sondland had with another U.S. diplomat, Bill Taylor.
In one of those exchanges, Taylor was concerned about withholding military aid to Ukraine to, he perceived, possibly help a political campaign. Sondland replied almost 5 hours later, denying any quid pro quo. Sondland is expected to tell lawmakers that President Trump told him to write back to Taylor that there was no quid pro quo. He took him at his word. Joining me now, CNN's Manu Raju on Capitol Hill. It's really remarkable, Manu, and I know you've been doing the same thing to read through this opening statement here because, for instance, on the text messages, et cetera, he says that, by encouraging this conversation to take place off text messages, he was not trying to hide anything. But on the other hand, as you noted earlier, he does differ with the president on a key aspect of all this, and that is involving his personal lawyer. In fact, directing Ukraine policy through his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani.
Yeah, this is a significant break from the president over the president's handling of this matter. His top diplomat for the European Union makes very clear that he was disappointed, in his words, quote, disappointed that the president had directed him to talk to Rudy Giuliani, and then learning later that Rudy Giuliani had an agenda that could help President Trump's 2020 re-election campaign. Now, essentially what this testimony shows is that this is that the president put on hold this effort to strengthen this key alliance in exchange for them reaching out to Giuliani to essentially get Giuliani to do what he was pursuing, which was this investigation into the Bidens, as well as this investigation into the 2016 elections. Now, getting to some of the specifics here is that earlier this year in May, after President Zelensky of Ukraine was inaugurated, Gordon Sondland and other top U.S. officials briefed the president about the fact that Zelensky wanted to strengthen relations, have a meeting and a call with the president. The president said, no thanks. He said, first talk to Mr. Giuliani. According to Gordon Sondland, said it was apparent to all of us that the key to changing the president's mind was talking to Giuliani, which he said he was disappointed that the president had made that direction. And then he says this, based on the president's direction, we were faced with a choice. We could abandon the goal of a White House meeting from President Zelensky, which we all believed was crucial to strengthening U.S.-Ukrainian ties and furthering long-held U.S. foreign policy goals in the region, or we could do as President Trump directed and talk to Mr. Giuliani to address the president's concerns. He said they were left with no choice, and they chose to address the president's concerns. He said that he wasn't aware until, quote, much later that Giuliani's agenda might have included an effort to prompt the Ukrainians directly or indirectly to help the president's 2020 election. Now, he said that he did talk to Rudy Giuliani only a handful of times. When he spoke to Rudy Giuliani asked for a public statement from Zelensky and said that this was at the direction of the president, but that he wanted that public statement to say he wanted to commit Ukraine to look into anti-corruption issues. Mr. Giuliani specifically mentioned the 2016 election, including the DNC server and Burisma, as two anti-corruption investigatory topics of importance for the president. Now, he says that Giuliani never explicitly said the Bidens, but Burisma is essentially code for Bidens because Hunter Biden is on the board of that energy company in Ukraine. Now, he did say that after that text message came up about saying quid pro quo, whether there was a quid pro quo to withhold that military aid, he did talk to the president about it. The president, according to Sondland, was in a, quote, bad mood and just said repeatedly there was no quid pro quo, but it's unclear if he was able to verify that in any way. But nevertheless, a huge break with the key administration presidential ally appointee, saying that the president directed him to do something that could help the president's reelection efforts.
Yeah, it's interesting. On the question of security assistance, he does say explicitly, I do not recall any discussions with the White House on withholding U.S. security assistance. As you note, the one conversation he bases the denial on is calling the president at one time. President, as you said, in a bad mood, says there's no quid pro quo multiple times. He goes on to say, in my opinion, security aid to Ukraine was in our vital national interest and should not have been delayed for any reason. I mean, that still leaves open the question, okay, if you're contending the aid was not delayed explicitly as part of a quid pro quo, then why was it delayed around the time that you're making these demands? I mean, that remains an open question that we haven't heard a explanation for. Yeah.
It does. Manu, let us know what else you hear. Yeah. I know the questioning is underway. We'll get back to you in just a minute. Members of your other of the fellow committees that are questioning Ambassador Sondland right now, and we have received his opening remarks where he will say that he was, and I'm paraphrasing here, disappointed that at the president's direction he and his team were told to go around State Department officials, career officials, and deal with the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, on all things Ukraine, and specifically investigations, specifically into Burisma, which of course meaning Hunter Biden. What do you think is the most important question, now that we know this from Sondland, that lawmakers need to get an answer from him on today?
Well, isn't it interesting, an ambassador that was a political appointee, and I don't judge all political appointees who have ambassadorships, but who was known to not have a lot of experience, could at least understand that this was wrong-headed, upside down, and even maybe illegal, to sidestep professional sworn officers of the United States who have the responsibility of upholding the interests of the people of the United States and go to a paid, lacking in any moral judgment as it relates to this effort to be your face in Ukraine, a desperate country needing to be protected against Russia and desperately needing the military funds. You know, Poppy, it joins into the most egregious foreign policy decision that I've seen in decades, maybe in the last 100 years, and that is the decision made on a Sunday night when various Americans were with their families or praying to unleash terror into Syria and to allow the Turkish forces to overrun the Kurds, but more importantly, to literally enhance and create a national security threat for the United States of America. This is all combined. So the question I would want to follow up with, Ambassador, you indicated that you thought it was wrong to sidestep policy into Giuliani. Are you telling me that you do not fully appreciate the fact that there was a quid pro quo? You called the president, you said he was angry and shouted out, no quid pro quo. But in your honesty under oath, are you saying that you had no inkling or no thought that this was a quid pro quo foreign policy?
Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, will hear a lot more when, after this testimony of Sondland wraps up. I appreciate your time on both of those fronts this morning. And again, we're so sorry for your loss of your dear friend, Congressman Cummings.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. God bless.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said President Trump had a meltdown during a meeting on Syria yesterday. He told a different story. He says it was the speaker, accused her of having a meltdown, both of them using this picture to make their point. Meanwhile, CNN has learned a months-long investigation into President Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, now includes, and this is crucial, a counterintelligence probe.
Joining us to talk about all of this, CNN legal analyst Ross Garber. He teaches impeachment law at Tulane. He has also notably represented 4 governors who have faced impeachment before. Good morning. You know a thing or two about this process. So let's just begin with the significance of Sondland's testimony that is happening right now on Capitol Hill. Because he was, shall I say, such a Trump loyalist, and what we know from his opening statement that he is saying about the president and Ukraine, how big is this in the inquiry?
I think he's actually an incredibly key witness. He's important for all those reasons. He's also a key link between the government of Ukraine, the president, and notably Rudy Giuliani. He's a guy, and Secretary of Energy Rick Perry. Sondland is at the center of a lot of this, and so I think what he has to say is important. And as we know, concerns have been raised about, what he thought he was doing on behalf of the president with Rudy Giuliani.
He's already said in his opening statement explicitly that the president directed him and others to run Ukraine policy through his personal lawyer. So to quote a lawyer, let's stipulate that for a moment here. On the question of whether there was a quid pro quo, withholding financial military assistance from Ukraine and a presidential visit unless they investigated Joe Biden, he bases his denial on one phone call. He says in his testimony that he called President Trump. The president responded, nothing. There is no quid pro quo. The president repeated no quid pro quo multiple times. This was a very short call, and I recall the president was in a bad mood. It strikes me that this, he's not saying there was an explicit quid pro quo. And that's hard to prove, because it's not like you're going to have a record of a presidential call here saying, take this away until I get X. So short of that, legally, how do you prove that there was a quid pro quo?
Well, first of all, I read his prepared remarks, and I would probably have days of questions for him.
Yeah.
One of I think the big issues is what he thought was going on here. If there wasn't a quid pro quo, what did he think was going on?
Yeah.
If he wasn't doing the president's personal bidding, what did he think Rudy Giuliani's place was in this as his personal?
He doesn't in his testimony provide. He says that it would be wrong to delay military assistance, but he doesn't provide an alternate explanation for why that military assistance was delayed at this time.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And at least in my experience, also, when people start speaking Latin to you, you have reason to ask some questions about what's actually going on there. Yeah.
What do you make of the president's behavior? We just showed you that tense meeting with Nancy Pelosi, calling her a third-rate lawmaker, once again throwing former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis under the bus. To what end? I don't know. What do you make of his behavior in the middle of an impeachment inquiry?
Yeah, I'm actually sort of perplexed by the president's actions and also the actions of those around him in the context of an impeachment inquiry. Normally, what you would want to do in order to survive this kind of thing is show that you're in control, show that you're working for the American people, show that you're trying to accomplish things, show that there's no reason for you to be impeached. And the letter to President Erdogan was odd, to say the least. The tweets have been very, very, I think, troubling, and even the actions of his White House in response to the impeachment inquiry are odd in terms of sort of the just general stonewalling as opposed to articulating
the reasons each time.
Exactly right.
Okay.
And so I think those things, if I were representing the White House or the president, would be troubling to me.
Thank you, Ross.
Always good to have you.
Good to see you.
See you very soon. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the UK and the EU have reached a deal on Brexit. The question this morning is, will it pass the UK Parliament? We're in Brussels with the latest next.